Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. It seems that PRI podcast listeners can't get enough about the topic of affordable housing. Each time we do a podcast on housing, it makes the record books for listening audiences. So in this podcast, Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, sat down with Tia Boatman Patterson, Executive Director of the California Housing Finance Agency, which supports the needs of renters and home buyers by providing financing and programs to low and moderate income Californians. Cal HFA is a rare government agency that is completely self-supporting. Its bonds are repaid by revenues generated through mortgage loans, not taxpayer dollars. I think you'll find this interview as informative as I did. Thanks for listening.
Well, Tia, welcome to PRI's podcast. It's a great thrill to have you here.
Thank you, Tim. I'm glad to be here.
So this is what we're calling the Tim and Tia Show, because for our listeners, Tia and I became thick as thieves in the legislature when we worked together back in the day, and we encountered way too many crazy things during our previous life, and hanging out in the back of the assembly floor watching all the craziness. And so I think to start out, I don't know that everybody knows about you, so I think you have a very interesting journey here to this place. So maybe you could share with our listeners how you got to where you are today, running an agency that plays such an important role in solving our housing puzzle.
Well, Tim, I guess how far do you want me to go back? Do you want me to go back to college? Do you want me to go back to what gave me my interest in housing? How far do you want me to go back?
Whatever's most entertaining.
Well, let's see. I'll start with my legislative career and then how that took me around a kind of a rotation and then what gave me kind of my passion to do what I'm doing. I started in the legislature as a policy consultant. I had finished law school in 94 and worked as a policy consultant. And in 1998, I was the chief consultant of the Assembly Housing Committee. And I had came out of law school in 94, but I hadn't really practiced law except for a small amount of time. So that took me to local government when I left the legislature the first time and worked for as agency counsel with the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency. And so I had been doing housing and community development at a policy level, but to actually be a practitioner and do it at really put the laws that I had helped pass, how they really affected communities, I had the ability to do that. And then I left agency counsel with Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency and I became a municipal attorney, redevelopment attorney, community development, affordable housing attorney with law firm Best & Krieger. They had a Riverside office and they were just opening up their Sacramento office. And that was 2003, 2004. I found private practice wasn't really for me. Those billable hours just weren't working. I had just had a set of twins and it just wasn't working. And I was invited back to the legislature to take a position as chief consultant of the Jobs and Economic Development Committee. And I was approached by the speaker's staff when I was thinking about making a move back to private practice. And the chief of staff for the speaker, and it was Fabian Nunez, Danny Eaton, said, I remember when you worked for the legislature the first time around, and I really would like you to consider coming and working for the speaker. And I said, well, what would I be doing? And he said, housing and community development, small business, all of the things that I was very passionate about. So I went and worked for Fabian Nunez, and I worked for him the whole time he was speaker, and we did some absolutely incredible things. At the time, I think you might have been working for Kevin McCarty. And I mean, it was a wonderful time to work in the legislature. I mean, we passed Proposition 1C, which was the largest housing bond, but it wasn't just about housing. We looked at it as a package, an integrated package. It was housing, transportation, water, schools. And so the staff actually came together and looked at it holistically as well. And then I worked for a short time with Karen Bass. And then, lo and behold, the general counsel position came up at Sacramento Housing Redevelopment Agency, and I went back as their general counsel. So I did that for a number of years. It was very difficult in 2011-12 when redevelopment was eliminated, and redevelopment was a large part of what the agency was doing. A lot of funds were coming in for redevelopment and affordable housing. And so that was a difficult time trying to shore up the walls and at a local level when you had fewer resources and at the time fewer federal resources. We were making it happen. Sacramento Housing Redevelopment Agency is still over there like the little engine that could. And I was appointed as the board of directors by Speaker Perez to the California Housing Finance Agency Board of Directors in 2012. Well, in 2014, the governor's office approached me about coming and being the director of California Housing Finance Agency. And I'm like, if I'm going to work for the state of California, that's that's the agency I would want to work for. And so that's how I ended up getting in this particular position. It was really like a double rotation. Legislature, local government, private practice, then here. So I think every job I've ever had has literally prepared me for this job, and I'm absolutely loving it. So the passion comes from my childhood and growing up in the Central Valley. You know, I grew up in the Central Valley. I was a single mom with 2 girls. We had no idea we were poor. We lived in a mixed income neighborhood, even though it was public housing. It was public housing, a small little 4-plex unit. I mean, the chief of police's mother was our next door neighbor. And it was just a rich experience growing up as a child. My mother bought her first house in the 70s, so we moved from public housing to her first home. She used a first-time home buyer program. In the 70s, they had opened up lending. Federal law had just come about to prevent discrimination against women who were single women who wanted to lend. And so because of some of those programs and a first-time home buyer program, she was able to purchase her first home. She used that home and the fact that she had 2 girls, she leveraged that home to break generational cycles of poverty. Both my sister and I have college degrees. We both have graduate degrees. And I have seen where housing literally has stabilized lives and has literally helped break generational cycles of poverty. And so to do what I do and what I'm doing now is because of that passion and that background.
So, as our listeners can probably already tell, this is the expert to talk about anything housing related, which has been one of our big issues here at PRI. And it seems like there's no shortage of material of things to talk about these days. So, let's talk a little bit about the agency that you run. Our listeners may have never heard of it before. So, as director of California Housing Finance Agency, you really do play an important role in helping people find an affordable place to live. So can you talk a little bit about the work that you do and what the agency does to make this dream of homeownership possible?
So the agency was created in 1975 when Brown was the governor the first time. And so we've been in existence for 40 years. The agency is literally the state of California's affordable housing bank. We run 2 main programs, a homeownership program and a multifamily program. When we were created in statute, our homeownership program provides that we do not do direct lending because they didn't want us competing in the private market. And so what we do is we use a series of lender network partners who originate the loans for us. We purchase the loans, and then those loans are sold on the secondary market. Now, up until the housing crisis, we had used mortgage revenue bonds to help finance those loans and sell, and we kept those loans here on our portfolio. This new model that we're using now presents a lot less risk to the agency, allows us to bring in private capital and use our private sector partners to be able to create home ownership opportunities here in California. On this multifamily side, we do provide direct lending to developers. And on that side, we do issue bonds, tax-exempt bonds. We utilize a HUD risk share program where we can bring down or do credit enhancements so that we can pass on that low-cost financing to a developer. And those are our 2 main programs, a multifamily program and a home ownership program. So that's generally what we do. What sets us apart on the home ownership side is that we do provide down payment assistance. So we're literally targeting first-time home buyers in that low to moderate income space.
A lot of people may not be familiar with all the different programs you offer. You mentioned some just now, but I know one of the things that may be kind of at the top people are remembering the mortgage crisis and for all the home foreclosure issues, especially in places like San Bernardino and places that were hit very hard. So can you talk about some of these different programs that you offer in that area and how our listeners can learn more about them?
So we do run the Keep Your Home California program, which as a result of the housing crisis, the federal government, through the Housing Economic Recovery Act, the HERA legislation and the TARP legislation, came about and provided $2 billion to the state of California. There were 18 what they considered hardest hit states, and California was one of the hardest hit states. We received the biggest allotment of those funds. And through that Keep Your Home California program, we have helped prevent avoidable foreclosure. We have assisted more than 82,000 families to keep their home. And it was not just about keeping them in the home for the short term, but making sure that they were able to keep their home and it be a sustainable mortgage. So that was a very successful program. As of June, we will be winding down that program. We have gone through that entire allotment of $2 billion, and we're now working on some of the recycled funds. And so our original allotment of the $2 billion has been expended, which is why we're winding down that program. We did see that it was continued to be useful, and it continues to be useful. We're seeing some default rates in some of our current County cities now. So we're very active in Kern County. So even though we're winding down that program, there'll be a tail on that program. So those folks that had were unemployed and had come in for unemployment mortgage assistance, that they will continue to be eligible during that tail period. That was a very extremely program. I think it helped ensure that property values were kept up because you didn't have the vacancies, people leaving their homes. In addition to that, we had an economic impact study to show for every federal dollar that came in, that California had an economic impact multiplier of 2.1. And so it was $2 billion that came in, but the economic impact that it had to California was significant. And so we ran that program very well and very efficiently. And I think even U.S. Treasury and Congress was very happy with the way we ran that program.
If Congress has given you the seal of approval, you must be doing something right. We're pleased to get to talk to you today because your agency is the type of agency that us free marketeers love, that you might be the unicorn. You're the self-supporting state agency. So talk about your unique status. And I know you've mentioned to me you've had some battles in Washington in recent months trying to preserve some of these resources. So you mentioned private activity bonds that were a key tool that is used by your agency to finance housing projects. I know that was an underreported story in the tax reform debate.
Oh my goodness. I don't think that they realized that private activity bonds generally went to housing. I believe that it was a lack of education at the congressional level, but during the tax reform, they literally proposed elimination of private activity bonds. That would have been catastrophic, especially here in California, because private activity bonds are the way we generally finance our multifamily developments. And private activity bonds also are the way in which you trigger the 4% low-income housing tax credit. So you wouldn't have just lost the volume cap, you would have lost access to those 4% low-income housing tax credits, which is significant here in California. It was projected that if we didn't have those financing and those resources coming to California, that we would annually lose about 20,000 units of housing a year. So that was pretty significant. And also the misconception, I think, was that private activity bonds were going to build golf courses and things like that. But here in California, private activity bonds literally were financing over the last 10 years. Almost 40% were used to finance affordable housing, 40% to hospitals, and 14 to 15% to education. So almost 90% of the private activity bonds were going through those three categories: housing, hospitals, and education. And so that would have been a significant loss of resources to California. So as a self-supporting agency, we do not receive a general fund appropriation for our operations. Our operations run about $40 million a year, and we do not receive any general fund dollars for that. Let me repeat, we do not receive any general fund dollars for that. So we have to operate like a business. So we will lend money out, borrow money at a lower cost, lend it out at a little bit higher cost, and that difference between what we have access to the capital to and what we lend it out to is that spread. And that spread is what we use to pay for our operations, our staff operations, etc. And so having access to capital is extremely important to a bank. So since I have been here, our credit ratings have increased 7 times. Our credit ratings now are outstanding. So now we do have that access to that private capital, and we can bring that private capital into the state of California and able to lend that and pass those savings on to our lender developers or our home borrowers who want to have access to an affordable mortgage.
You and your agency have been making some news lately, and I think it's an interesting way to look about it. So when people think about affordable housing, they think about helping the homeless or very low-income people. But you've made the point that in very expensive California, you must also think about helping the middle class afford a home too. So explain your thinking here and talk about some of the things that your agency is doing to help the middle class buy a home too.
Well, our mandate, our charter does say that we're to help low to moderate income folks here in California. And so we don't want to miss that moderate piece. Historically, the way we have helped moderate income folks is through a homeownership program. Low income was considered to be multifamily multifamily, and homeownership was considered available to the moderate income. Well, as you see homeownership prices soaring to getting to the point to where they're so high, sometimes they're pricing out our moderate income folks. And so there is what we call this missing middle that made too much for traditional multifamily subsidized housing because they were making an income that was above 60% of the area median income, and which tax credits aren't available for those kind of housing. So that 60 to 80% area median income, entry-level teachers, entry-level firefighters, and then you take those folks and you put them in a high-cost area where rents are soaring, and then those rents become unaffordable. So then I have seen CalHFA's role to come in and serve or try to serve in those niches or those areas that aren't traditionally being served. So on the home ownership side, some of the things that we've done is we've broadened our income limits so that folks could have access to housing. There were statutes on the books from almost 40 years that allowed housing authorities to go up to 150% of the area median income on the home ownership side, but we were still limiting ourselves to 120% of the area median income. But there was no statutory reason for us to do that. We weren't using mortgage revenue bonds, so we went and took a look at that. We went to our board, and our board unanimously approved us expanding or broadening the amount of our home ownership programs. And as of the end of this fiscal year, we're looking at providing over $2 billion worth of lending and helping over 7,500 homeowners. And I think that may be the most in CalHFA's history of assistance in helping first-time homebuyers. On the multifamily side, you need a spectrum of housing, whether it's homeless, very extremely low income, all the way to moderate income. And so what we're trying to do on the multifamily side, there was legislation that was passed that provides a continuous appropriation to CalHFA out of the permanent funds. It was SB2 with Atkins. And it's a small stream of money, $30 to $40 million annually that will be coming to us. But what we're going to do is we're going to use that to plug in those gaps on some of those mixed income developments. I am very much ideologically in support of mixed income. You remember I told you I came from a mixed income community. I think those kind of communities and developments are more sustainable. Kids grow up, they have a broader experiences, and they're just richer for that mixed income and that diversity. And so on the multifamily side, that's how we're trying to come in. We're trying to come in to make sure that we're helping support and incentivize mixed income communities.
So you touched on it just a little bit. So last year, the legislature enacted several measures to address California's housing crisis. There was a very famous Housing Day signing ceremony in San Francisco. And I think in looking at the pictures, I spied you in the crowd there. And this is something PRI's written a lot about, these different measures. And our scholars have had kind of a mixed view. I think we kind of take the approach that they're steps in the right direction, but they in and of themselves are not going to solve all the problems, that there's more that we could be doing. So what's your view? Do you think last year's housing package will make a real difference in increasing home affordability?
I believe it was a down payment. I think the package as it was structured was trying to get at this all of the above approach. California Forward, along with the McKinsey Group, came up with kind of this, what will it take? How will we build ourselves out of this? How do we grow ourselves out of this? And they have literally come back and said it's an all of the above approach. And so what I think we've done is we've put in a down payment, but we have to continue to look at some of the things that are barriers to housing. And it took us 40 years to get into this hole. So I don't believe we're going to be able to wave a magic wand and it be over with. We're going to have to look at some regulatory relief. We're going to have to look at some incentives, and we're going to have to look at resources, because regulatory relief alone isn't going to get us there. Incentives alone isn't going to get us there, and resources alone aren't going to get us there. And so it really is going to have to be an all of the above approach. And so I am excited to see some of the collaboration that is going to be required from some of the legislation that passed, whether it's the state working with locals, incentivizing locals, providing block grants to locals so that they can get their affairs in order so they can plan for and be ready for the higher densities when they come. Some resources available for homeless assistance so that we can help provide rental assistance and coordinated entries of systems and help at the local level so that they can get their infrastructure in place. And we've recently seen other folks come to the table, whether it's philanthropic folks, whether it's healthcare, but all of those are folks are coming to the table and saying, what can we do for this affordable housing crisis? Because it touches, whether it's education or health, it touches all of transportation, it touches all of those areas as well. And so what I do see is a down payment and mechanisms put in place so that you can start having those partnerships.
So let's talk a little bit on the supply front. You know, we've argued at PRI, and I don't think there's much disagreement that you really aren't going to make a big dent in the housing crisis and increase affordability affordability until you increase supply. And even with last year's legislation, there's still a lot of log jams out there holding up housing projects across the state. So I'm going to make you queen for the day. Now, you're queen of the day every day here in this agency, but I'm going to make you the queen of California. What other changes would you make if you could wave your wand to break the housing logjam?
I would build. Because I think you need to get to the supply issue. And the supply issue, we have been underbuilding, like I said. It took us 40 years to get in this mess. The Department of Housing and Community Development, which is our sister agency, HCD, put out a housing assessment for their statewide housing assessment. And we are building about 80,000 units a year. We should be building 180,000, and we have underbuilt for the last 10 years. So the number of housing units we need far exceeds what we're doing. So I would wave my magic wand and I would build. And everywhere where they said we should build and could build and made sense for us to build, we'd be building.
So I know the other big issue that where your agency has been involved, and you've touched on it a little, is helping to address the homeless crisis, which it seems like it gets worse by the day. And I know that $500 million, I believe, was included in the budget. And for our listeners, we're taping this as the budget's being signed, so we haven't gone through the vetoes yet. So we'll just say $500 million for local and state homeless programs. And I know there are other big dollar asks on the table to combat homelessness. So talk about some of the things that you're working on in this area and what you think needs to be done.
Well, in 2008, we had an allocation of $400 million for mental health service dollars, in which we partnered with the Department of Mental Health, Department of Behavioral Health. I'm not sure who it was back in 2008. It was one of those departments, because since then we've had some reorganizations now in Department of Healthcare Services. But that $400 million, the goal was, with that $400 million, we would provide housing, regulated housing for individuals and families that were suffering from mental illness and homeless or at risk of homelessness. And the goal was, can we create 2,500 units of regulated units, and could that be leveraged to 10,000 units of affordable housing? Well, we used that $400 million, and we did just that. There's over 2,500 units of regulated MHSA housing, and those were integrated into other affordable developments, such that we've leveraged that to create 10,000 units of affordable housing. And that was during a period where access to credit wasn't happening, because that was during the housing crisis. So we literally used that to continue to construct affordable housing and incentivize affordable housing during the period when there wasn't much financing going on. So with those experiences, we went back out and talked to all of the counties and said, counties, who would you be interested in continuing to partner and have us provide loan servicing for you using your MHSA dollars that come to you directly? Now, we were having these conversations at the same time the legislature and Mr. De Leon was having conversations about No Place Like Home, which was to securitize those MHSA local dollars to create a $2 billion fund. Well, 14 counties stepped up and voluntarily contributed funds. We've continued to operate what we call a special needs housing program. And so the idea is, because the No Place Like Home got caught up in some litigation and there's some other things going on to try to move that program, that we are kind of the transition or the bridge to keep our program going until our sister agency, HCD, can take over and continue that using the No Place Like Home dollars. So I'm very excited that that's a way in which state agencies are collaborating. It's a way without legislation. We actually were proactive and went out and spoke to counties, and through what we have, participation agreements, we were able to meet the needs of our local counties and meet the needs of affordable housing for mentally ill individuals and families who are suffering from homelessness. In addition, there was legislation that created the Interagency Homeless Council. I believe that was legislation by Senator Holly Mitchell, and we have several members on that board. Our chief deputy, Don Kavir, was appointed by the governor to sit on that board. And as you know, there was, as part of that budget, that $500 million will be going to that interagency council to help coordinate some of those local government continuum of cares and homeless programs, because that's what we were seeing a lot. You know, with government, we often work in our silos. And so creating an interagency council where you have Department of Healthcare Services Services, you have the Secretary of Business Consumer Services Housing, you have homeless advocates, you have them all on this council and county and local representation so that you can coordinate all of those programs. And now they have the funding to help match and incentivize some of those programs. So it's very exciting.
Let's end on a little more philosophical note. You know, these issues of poverty and have been a big issue for PRI this year, and we put out a big study earlier this year, and we've made the case that, of course, there's a role for government in this area, but there's also a big role for private charities and nonprofits in helping people in need and getting them back on track. And in our research, we found that, in general, private charities, you could argue, are doing an even more effective job than government in helping to lift people out of poverty. So looking at it philosophically, what do you think is the proper role for both government and these private charities in helping to alleviate homelessness and poverty?
Well, getting back to what I said before, we all have to work together and align our resources. And there is a role for government when we're talking about a social safety net. But if we worked in alignment and with aligning our resources and partnerships and collaboration where it makes sense to do that, I think we should be open to do that. One of the specific programs that I may not have mentioned earlier is the Federal Financing Bank HUD Risk Share program, in which we partner with the federal government. And it's one of those programs that the government actually makes money. Yeah, who knew? So the way it works is the Federal Financing Bank buys a participation into a multifamily housing development that is underwritten by a housing finance agency. The housing finance agency, in partnership with HUD guarantees the participation, and the housing finance agency, takes on 50% of the risk. We need private developers to build the housing. Well, we provide the low-cost financing. The private developer comes in and builds the housing, and it's a win-win for everyone. And so by aligning your resources and having strategic partnerships, I think that's going to be one of our main ways in which we can alleviate poverty, homelessness, build more housing, is aligning our resources and in partnership with one another.
Well, helping people afford a home is hard work. So I think we need to celebrate all these new home buyers with an adult beverage. And, you know, Tia and I have been known to enjoy an adult beverage every now and then. So please share with our listeners your recommendation for a wine or other adult beverage that they should try.
During the summer months, I'm really fond of a nice Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris. And I like it when it's more crisp and apple flavory. So I found that the Santa Margarita is a very nice Pinot Gris. I really like that one. And it's pretty affordable. For a cocktail, House across the street serves this wonderful cucumbery, crisp little vodka drink that is just quite delicious. We might have to go try that.
Thanks to our guest, Tia Boatman Patterson, and to Tim Anaya. For more information on the California Housing Finance Agency, go to calhfa.ca.gov. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.